Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Oliver Wieck. I'm the Secretary General of ICC Germany, and I cordially welcome everyone to the opening of ICC's International Forum on the Future of International Supply Chains, Sustainable, Digital, and Smart. More than 1,600 registrations from around 40 countries for our forum, and the following workshops between June and October are a very strong signal of the huge worldwide interest in topics related to the management, the design, and the future trends of international supply chains. Thank you very much for joining. I'm particularly pleased that we have been able to attract exciting speakers for today's opening event. Each of the speakers have their own perception on the challenges and the opportunities of international supply chains. I'm very much looking forward to exchanging views with Executive Director Pamela Cook-Hamilton, State Secretary Ulrich Nussbaum, who will join us in a minute, Parliamentary State Secretary Norbert Bartle, Chief Executive Officer Frank Appel, Secretary General John Jensen, and our Chairman Holger Bingmann. Before I hand over to Holger Bingmann, I would like to inform all speakers and participants that the event will be recorded. Mr. Bingmann, the floor is yours. Your microphone.
This is the same mistake of all guys at that time. Oliver, thank you very much for handing over. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us in this morning or afternoon, wherever you are. I'm completely convinced that there couldn't be better times to speak about international supply chains and discuss on solutions on the current challenges than right now. We all saw the pictures over the weekend. We saw the several meetings there. So it's absolutely the right time for our conference now and the right time to talk about this. Luckily, we are slowly moving towards an end of the pandemic as we think of it. And even if 1 billion vaccines for developing countries is not enough, it sends a strong signal from the G7 weekend to the rest of the world to replicate and intensify everyone's efforts for a fair and just distribution and production of vaccines. Trade, for my understanding, is back on track, even as even as the, let's say, the reanimation of production is not so easy as we all thought of it. But trade is back not only in Asia, also in Europe and the Americas. So the time is absolutely right to reflect how global trade can work for everyone, everywhere, and every day. We know that we need to work on, and this is only, and it's not only, not only about the pandemic that I'm talking about. It includes absolutely the impacts of climate change, the conservation of resources, and the respect of human rights and labor standards. So it is once again the right time. We all know these challenges for a year, but maybe it's now the right time to move from talk to concrete action. If there's anything positive about the pandemic situation throughout the last year, and then it has absolutely accelerated digitalization, the scaling of existing and new technologies, and maybe even the reshaping or rethinking of supply chains. Societies are far more interconnected as we thought of it. And on the other hand, we realized about this strong connection between producers, deliverers, logistic partners throughout the world. So we are absolutely, and my understanding, have to change a little bit our attitude. New technologies in these sectors should not be developed to have something more for a cheaper price. And if you allow me the example, one of my little daughters at the age of 13, she luckily buys at Shein in China, where a new trouser costs about €5. And it's difficult to explain her from her father's side not to buy 5 trousers at the same time of a price of a sandwich. So my personal attitude is let's make use of these new technologies in order to develop new things. ICC is recognized as a supporter of these rule-based global trading system, and it has since a long time made clear that sustainability, inclusiveness, human rights, climate and environment figure on the top of our agenda. We absolutely address this on G7, T20, WTO, and luckily on the UN side. So meetings, events like this help us reminding that the global business community has to take action now on their own behalf in partnership with policymakers and the society as a whole. So let me conclude this at our forum. We want to have a look on how trade conflicts and eventually COVID pandemic has really affected our supply chain. How can we be more resilient for the future? How do companies address the issue of corporate supply chain responsibility? Which initiatives and measures do we take to protect human rights? Digitalization, as we mentioned before, will ease our daily business. It can save billions throughout the costs of, but the thing is now we need to change from thinking to action now. This international forum is a great opportunity for everybody to get insights, generate new ideas, and reflect on ongoing and future trends. I'm curious to see where the discussion in the workshop in the next month will lead us, and thank you for being a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Holger Bingmann. And it's a special honor for me now to welcome Frank Appel, the CEO of Deutsche Post DHL Group. At a very early stage, Deutsche Post DHL expressed its commitment to support ICC Germany, and we are very grateful for you, Mr. Appel, and Stephen Pope and his team at GoTrade that you joined the forum as our strategic partner. Herr Appel, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Holger, for first of all for welcoming and the opportunity to talk to you today. Because ICC and ICC Germany, I think, are important people for us, or organizations for us, to give the business a voice, and that's the reason why we are very happy to support your activities, because we need groups like yourself, which are really making clear what the benefit, the contribution of business can be to solve the problems. So I only want to give some thoughts to the whole discussion about supply chain. The first is, I say with some pride that our industry really has helped the world to stay on track somehow. If I read headlines, supply chains are broken, this is fact-free. Actually, the supply chain have worked. We had very few incidences that really supply chains are broken. Yes, we had sometimes capacity constraints, but overall supply chains have worked. Of course, it was a highlight, and you read that out when Bloomberg wrote in autumn the following headline: DHL, FedEx, and UPS are ready to save the world. And that was a reflection of that we will be able to distribute. Of course, I like the order, DHL, FedEx, and UPS. I think that reflects well the capabilities of us. But it's a very nice reflection of what really has happened. A couple of months ago, I saw a cartoon in The Economist who said the vaccines are now coming and the logistics are still under construction. So that was a cartoon where the bridge was still under construction. This was never true, but it's a sentiment and a myth that logistics chains are not working. We have delivered already 350 million to more than 150 countries around the world vaccines, just us, our company. And we are more than willing and capable to help the G7 to distribute 1 billion or more to any destination. That shows the power of the whole industry. It's not only us, we are not the only one in our field, but I think logistics companies are very capable to keep the world moving. And I think we have proven that in the last, couple of months very nicely. So the second theme is globalization. You can read very often globalization is at the end. We will see nearshore, offshore. That's a complete myth. We have a lot of discussion with customers. What they are looking for is more resilience. Not a single consumer will pay for any extra cost because products are manufactured nearshore. If you tell them, listen, your mobile phone cost 25 or 50% more, but don't worry, the production was more resilient. The consumer will say, I don't care, I buy that every 3-4 years, and I want to have maximum value for money. So the answer is not to nearshore. The answer is to think about how you can construct the supply chain more resilient by having more, production sites, for instance, and that is a discussion we have at the moment with many of our customers. Can we not make the supply chain more resilient? That you think about disruption, so that means what kind of inventory you hold where. But the dream that everything comes back to Europe and the US or whatever is a dream and will not happen. It would be also wrong, because the production gave a lot of people very good jobs around the world. So that's number 2 I just want to talk. So globalization actually, and we have proven that, has been the answer to the problem, is not the problem. The production of vaccines has been able to be, the development of the vaccine has been a global task, and even the production has been a global task. And even PPE, the world ramped up that massively, rapidly, because production was scaled and it was distributed very swiftly somehow. Third is free trade. I think that has been for discussion now that free trade is bad. Actually, free trade is very good. You can see that in all countries. The governments ask me, what should I do as a developing country? And of course, I haven't traveled that much, and that's the reason why I haven't seen too many governments from developing countries. But my answer to that, you have to do 3 things. First, education. Second, infrastructure. And third is free trade. What we will see after the pandemic, those countries who have good education system, good infrastructure, and good free trade agreements will recover much faster. The difference between those countries and the rest will enlarge and not shrink. And I think we have to make that constantly clear that free trade is good for the countries and not bad. Fourth topic, and it's also part of the theme today, is digitalization. So of course we have learned that digitalization has moved the needle quite a bit. Digitalization in our industry is fantastic news. If you think about logistics, it's actually waste. It's unnecessary, but we can't beam products. So the more we avoid cost in the supply chain, the better is it for the world, because we free up money for other purposes. That's the reason why digitalization will help us to make our supply chains much leaner, much more transparent, and much more effective. Corruption, for instance, the strongest enemy of corruption at borders is transparency. Digitalization will bring that. So all these elements will benefit significantly to make our supply chains more efficient, and that's great news and not bad news. By the way, it will enlarge the group of people who are working in our industry as well, because we will see more logistics on a global scale and not less. E-commerce is also something which definitely will stay not only in the B2C world, but also in the B2B world. But more importantly, you can also read a lot of headlines saying, oh, e-commerce is bad for the environment. This is another myth which is completely untrue. We have made calculations, what the landed costs are for products to get to consumers, and it's very clear that it's better to have an e-commerce order. Just in Germany, to drive with the average, car with a carbon footprint of an average combustion engine car, you can drive 3 kilometers to have the same carbon footprint than the whole end-to-end process for our parcels. So 3 kilometers is not very far. And we are actually working already in Germany with 15,000 electric delivery vans, which are reducing for this part already the carbon footprint quite a bit, because of course the last mile delivery is a significant chunk. If we get better vehicles for the long haul, like hydrogen-based or biofuel-based, trucks, then we can reduce it further. So, the opposite from the myth is true, that e-commerce is actually good for sustainability, even on a global scale. So I disagree a little bit with Holger, what you said. The stuff your daughter buys has to be transported anyway. It will be just, produced in China, regardless if she goes to a store or if she buys online. But when she goes to the store, she generates even more carbon footprints, because the store needs light, heating, and all this kind of stuff. So it's not always what the objective is. The same is actually for food. tomatoes produced in a greenhouse in the Netherlands have probably a higher footprint than tomatoes produced in a developing warm country, because the logistics cost on a vessel, on a shipping vessel, is very tiny per tomato. And the trucking from the harbor or from the Netherlands to Germany is probably higher than the carbon footprint from southern cone or southern down under for kiwis to Hamburg, for instance. But this is not known, and that's the reason why we have a lot of myth around what e-commerce and supply chains might generate. Finally, nevertheless, we can make supply chains significantly more sustainable, and that's our job, and that's a job of the industry. We ourselves have committed to produce or to fly with our airplanes by 2030, 30% of our aviation fuel should be sustainable aviation fuel. We will invest in the next decade 7 billion into become greener. I think this is absolutely doable, that we go there. We want to enlarge our electronic fleet. So the logistics industry has to do his part, and we will. And we are very much committed to do that. But sometimes, maybe if I read headlines of newspapers, you hear something like the opposite. So this is addressing things like globalization, free trade, digitalization, e-commerce, and sustainable. I think there are many opportunities for our industry, and we want to be a part of the solution and not a problem. And I think we as an industry have very good answers to the challenges. So with that, concluding, I think supply chains are fundamentally important. We have just proven that. We say that with pride. We have since more than a decade in our company a clear purpose, connecting people, improving lives. And what we have seen in the last 3 quarters or 4 quarters, our colleagues around the world are particularly proud that they have seen the impact they had for many other people. I think we really have contributed to that. We got out of the mess quite rapidly in comparison to the problem we face. And that makes us as a company very proud, and it makes our 570,000 people around the world very proud. And with that, I hand over back to you, Oliver, for that impulse to the discussion. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Frank Appel, for this insight. You mentioned quite some important issues like improving resilience of supply chains, like investing into education systems and infrastructure. And I'm quite sure that our guest speaker and speaker of today's keynote, Pamela Cook-Hamilton, which I cordially and sincerely welcome today, will also tackle these issues in her speech. ITC's main focuses are to help SMEs to succeed in international business and to help developing countries to expand trade opportunities and to cooperate with the private sector. This purpose makes ICC a natural partner of ITC, as we are also committed to sustainable and inclusive global trade that benefits all parts of the society in all countries, or, as our mission puts it, we make business work for everyone, every day, everywhere. Together with our national and international participants, I'm very much looking forward to the presentation of our guest of honor, Pamela Cook-Hamilton. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wick. I'm very, very excited to be here. Distinguished participants, thank you to the ICC for the invitation to be here today. The American author John Maxwell once said, "Change is inevitable, growth is optional." So the million-dollar question I posit to you today is, will the pandemic transform how international supply chains operate in the future? Tension, scarcity, business losses, and supply vulnerability all characterized how supply chains reacted to the changing demands and transport disruptions of the pandemic. Temporary trade restrictions and shortages of pharmaceuticals, critical supplies, and many other products, from computer chips to pet food to tapioca for the increasingly popular bubble tea, highlighted how fragile supply chains can be. The overhanging geopolitical trade tensions of 2020 did not help. With a rise in economic nationalism, we saw more than 2,400 trade restricting initiatives introduced in 2020. This is on average more than 12 restrictions per country in the world, and removal of these temporary measures have not happened at the rate needed to return to a pre-COVID scenario. In a time of extraordinary upheaval in the global economy, just in time is running late, as pointed to in a recent article in the New York Times. As a consequence, companies worldwide are under greater political and competitive pressure to increase their domestic production, grow employment in their home countries, reduce or even eliminate their dependence on sources of supply that are perceived as risky, and rethink their use of lean manufacturing and just-in-time strategies. What changes can we expect and how fundamental would they be? The pressure to operate efficiently and optimize the use of capital, labor, and manufacturing capacity will remain, and so will the downward pressure on the price-quality ratio and related requirement for constant innovation and optimization. However, there will be pressure for suppliers in international value chains to be greener, more digitally savvy, more flexible, and innovative. There will be growing consumer interest in how goods are produced, where they originate, who contributes along the value chain, and how those suppliers are treated. Many of these suppliers into international supply chains are micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. Capable and efficient MSMEs are critical for buyers in international value chains to enhance their supply base, reduce risk, and take advantage of process innovations. I believe this is something very familiar to Germany and its Mittelstand corporate culture. Assisting MSMEs to manage risk and make the most out of new opportunities during the current crisis and to prepare for the new normal has been a focus of the International Trade Center. ITC, as you know, is the joint development organization of the UN and the WTO focused on enhancing the competitiveness and internationalization of MSMEs. We have seen how the impact of the COVID crisis has profoundly affected MSMEs supplying into international value chains. Our enterprise surveys and insights from 132 countries reveal 6 factors. 1, impact from reduced demand has been very sector specific. Durable use consumer goods, hospitality, travel, tourism, wholesale, and retail have been hit particularly hard. 2, sectors employing many women and with many women-owned and/or managed businesses have been most severely affected. 3, increased export restrictions and other trade policy measures have made international trade more difficult for the smallest. 4, MSMEs have been exposed to greater risk in international value chains as lead firms push risks from reduced demand towards their lower tier supplier base. 5, MSMEs have been tested in their ability to be agile, innovative, and adjust to new requirements and opportunities, while often facing severe cash flow constraints. 6th and finally, MSMEs without a digital footprint found it very difficult to pivot. The combination of these impacts has been particularly challenging to MSMEs in developing countries, where public financial support schemes have been fewer and much smaller as a percentage of GDP than those in the G7 or even G20 countries. As we look at building forward better, how can we ensure that one of the changes in supply chains is to do more to support their suppliers become more robust and resilient and be able to better manage risks and respond to systemic shocks in the future? It is likely that many supply chains will have an increasing focus on a triple bottom line, an emphasis on green and social inclusive aspects while also ensuring a competent, predictable supplier base. An increased green focus will affect many value chains and their suppliers. This intersection between trade and environmental and social policy will affect and often challenge producers, their market access, and their risk management. From the EU Green Deal to the French and German supply chains laws, we see that market access requirements are changing, directly impacting producers from developing countries. We are in dialogue with governments in destination markets and with MSMEs to help understand and interpret these requirements so they have their intended effect of improving sustainability without excluding MSMEs. It is important you continue to be part of these conversations as the ICC. We know that investment in circular production, climate adaptation technologies, and resource efficiency come with new opportunities, but also potential challenges and risks to the lower end of the supply chains. For these initiatives to have a positive developmental impact, there's an important supportive role for lead firms and buyers in international value chains. Transmission of knowledge down the supply chain, provision of predictability and stability, avoiding pushing risk down to the lower end of the supplier base, and supporting MSMEs to be agile and able to meet related standards, mandatory as well as private sustainability standards, are important initiatives in this regard. This will help rebalance risk and reward in supply chains. Another key element to help MSMEs continue to evolve with international supply chains is to strengthen the supportive ecosystems. A particularly important element in a supportive ecosystem is the provision of market-relevant skills. Skills and access to relevant, affordable finance are key determinants for the MSME's ability to move towards greening production. At ITC, we use industry partnerships to support vocational training, technical schools and universities, as well as to add innovation hubs and incubators to support critical upgrading of industry skills and capabilities. Access to affordable financing is also a major focus for ITC, where we work in partnership with major buyers, financial institutions, development banks, and non-traditional actors such as fintech. Supporting these initiatives to reduce the cost of borrowing, and more importantly, the cost of due diligence, are critical to developing resilient MSMEs and supply chains. One area that we're comfortable in predicting will characterize supply chains moving forward is more integration of the digital framework. From a deeper exploration of blockchain as a traceability tool to seeking new markets via e-commerce, we see lead firms and their small suppliers all recognizing the need to fully embrace the digital route to market and to greater transparency. Underpinning this move will be three elements: digital access and connectivity, digital affordability, and access to data. Some experts have described this period as the perfect storm for digital acceleration. The pandemic has exposed a clear digital divide. Those enterprises which had already invested in digital operating modes have, on average, fared much better than those which had not. Whether the focus is on e-commerce, digital skills, virtual coaching, or digital entrepreneurship, we have seen a rapid acceleration in the need for MSMEs to connect to international supply chains digitally and are helping them ride the wave. Building new online shops in Asia or in the Americas, nurturing early-stage tech startups in Africa, providing online business networks for young entrepreneurs can only be possible because of the widespread use of digital technologies enabled by connectivity. Still, many countries and users lack affordable and reliable connectivity, and only few players can grasp the complexity of all the dimensions of digital acceleration. 3.7 billion people around the world are still not even connected to the internet. Enabling global supply chains means to enable connectivity. To address this challenge will require the input of all in this room through global and regional partnerships such as the Broadband Commission and Smart Africa that address all sides of this enormous challenge. If I zero in more on the issue of access to data, we have seen that during the pandemic, many manufacturers in developing countries struggled to broaden their market segments and adjust their offerings. One fundamental reason for this was lack of access to relevant data and analysis to be able to make informed decisions. ITC, with the ICC, UNCTAD, WTO, and others, have worked together to try to solve this problem by piloting a one-stop shop web portal, the Global Trade Help Desk, to assist MSMEs throughout the world to get relevant, timely, and easy-to-use information on trade trends, trade requirements, and market access regulation for markets across the world. I understand that many ICC chambers are users of this online tool, and we look to you to continue to scale this up. In your deliberations this week, you will break into groups to talk about individual supply chain issues. The reflections and conclusions you make in each working group will be important and feed into the overall discussion. The intersection between these topics will provide new insights in relation to the complex transformation towards more sustainable, digital, and smart supply chains. ITC and the ICC network of chambers will continue to work together to learn from those points of intersection and make sustainable, digital, and smart trade happen. Also, for those producers who are currently not fully able to exploit the many new exciting international trade opportunities, that will also follow from these developments. It is part of your job and my job to make sure these MSMEs prosper in future supply chains. We can influence the changes that global supply chains make. We can help to capture the lessons learned from the pandemic and why you are indeed only as strong as the weakest link in your chain. We can push both change and growth. I wish you a fruitful forum on the future of international supply chains, and I look forward to hearing the deliberations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Executive Director Hamilton, Coke Hamilton, for your keynote speech. That gave us a lot of food for thought on the contribution of supply chains for the wealth creation, on the change of supply chain patterns because of climate change, because of circular economy, but also because of digitalization. So that's really quite some issues for our later panel discussion. Which I now would like to introduce the distinguished members. And I will start, he's not yet there, so then I will pick up this later. I will start with Mr. Norbert Bartle, Parliamentary State Secretary to the German Federal Minister of Economic Cooperation and Development. He is a member of the German Bundestag since 1998, and he's representing a region near Stuttgart, in the south of Germany, which is dominated by automotive suppliers and companies from the electronics and the IT sector. Before his current position, Norbert Bartle was Parliamentary State Secretary to the Federal Minister of Transport and Digital Infrastructure. Thank you very much, Mr. State Secretary, for joining our forum. And now can also introduce Ulrich Nussbaum, who just joined us. He's State Secretary at the German Federal Ministry of Economic, good morning, hello. For Economic Affairs and Energy. He's responsible for economic, industrial, and foreign trade policy, for digital and innovation policy, and for SME policy. Ulrich Nussbaum is also professor at the University of Bremen, and before he started his political life, he ran his own business in Bremerhaven. Thank you, Mr. State Secretary. We are very much honored that you are taking the time today. We're also happy that ICC Secretary General John Denton is joining today's opening. After having worked as a diplomat for the Australian government, John became partner and CEO of Corrs Chambers Westgarth, Australia's leading independent law firm. In 2018, John assumed the position of ICC Secretary General. CEO Frank Appel and Chairman Holger Bingmann will also join the panel discussion. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, Executive Director Coke Hamilton has to leave us at 10:50, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, Executive Director, for your inspiring keynote speech, which gave us, as I just said before, a lot of food for thought for our discussion. The panel discussion will be joined by Anders Aare, Director of the Division of Enterprises and Institutions at the ITC. Before I start with the third round of questions, I would like to thank our partners and sponsors, namely Deutsche Post DHL, the French-German ODDO BHF Bank, the French company BuyCo, the provider of a collaborative platform for container shipping. I also want to thank two major German business organizations, namely the Federation of German Industries and the Association of German Chambers of Industry and Commerce, which support us as networking partner. And I want to thank DVV Media Group for supporting the forum as our media partner. Without their know-how, without their organizational and financial support, today's event and the following workshops series would not have been possible. And a very big thank you also goes to the ICC, which promoted the forum on a global level, and to the many national committees from Europe, the Americas, Asia, and Africa for the promotion of the forum in their respective countries. This is a great example of an excellent cooperation within the global ICC network and certainly to be continued. Finally, a note to our participants. You're welcome to ask questions, and in that case, please use the chat function. However, given the amount of time, we cannot promise that we will be able to respond to every question. But what I can promise is that we will take your questions into account in the workshops that will follow between June and October. So, let's get started, and my first question goes to State Secretary Nussbaum. The environment for international supply chains has become much more challenging in recent years. Key words are trade conflicts, renationalization tendencies, impact of COVID-19, and most recently, difference between EU member states about the EU trade policy. Even the visit of US President Biden to the EU Commission yesterday didn't seem to have met the expectations. State Secretary Nussbaum, is the International Division of Labor facing a paradigm shift?
Yeah, Mr. Weg, Mr. Bingman, Mr. Denton, dear Appel, dear Kollege Bartel, dear ladies and gentlemen, I think that's really a good question, whether the International Division of Labor is facing a paradigm shift. Thank you also that I can join today's opening event of the ICC forum, and I would like to give you a clear answer. In my view, no. Yeah, and I think we have really to ensure in the future that it stays that way. As you know, and this is not a new idea, that COVID-19 has shown that we have seen severe disruptions in international trade, but we have also seen in the past months that international trade has helped us to come back and to cope with the crisis. So we have also seen that international trade has helped to meet the high demand for products considered critical in the COVID-19 crisis, as masks, for example. No? Without China, we would not have had at a certain moment all the masks we would have needed. Okay, now we, let's say, are more independent because we shifted more to national and European production, but most of all these products come from China, and therefore we see that International Division of Labor ensured that the production of these goods was ramped up all over the globe. And this is also true, as you know, with respect to vaccines. So I think international trade has helped us a lot and is going to help us a lot, but it also has showed some weaknesses in our supply chain. And I think what we have learned from the COVID crisis is that we have to address these weaknesses, and we have to do this in a smart way. Let me explain my thinking. I will point towards the relevance of global supply chains, and I will also discuss proper government action in this regards. In general, global supply chains have benefited industrial, emerging and developing countries. More than 36 million jobs within the EU, including 7.9 million jobs in Germany alone, are dependent on export to the rest of the world. Also now, big part of our recovery depends on export and the positive export which we have at the moment. And 70% of world trade is based on the supply of intermediate inputs. To me, therefore, there is no turning back the clock. This is, let's say, the clear message, and I'm convinced that keeping markets open and improving market access for companies needs to stay at the heart of trade and economy policy. And I know that this view is also convinced and is also shared by the European Commission, which highlighted openness and open strategic autonomy as major principle in its new trade policy strategy. And yet the concept of openness is not shared by all EU member states, and that's why we also need a strong voice of industry in support of open markets. And as I said at the beginning, the COVID-19 crisis has revealed some weaknesses and vulnerabilities of specific global supply chains, not of all, but of specific global supply chains. And national lockdowns have slowed or even temporarily stopped the flow of raw materials and finished goods, disrupting manufacturing in many countries. That was at the beginning. And we have dealt with these challenges, and I think now we have resolved the problem, but by having more trade and more openness. And we have also seen that in general, companies are best placed to analyze the resilience of their supply chains and to restructure them accordingly. So companies know where they have weaknesses, where they are strong, and what they have to do to keep their supply chains in good shape. So that's not, let's say, what we have to do in the government or to decide in the government. We have to do, we have to give the frames for this, for keeping the supply chains open. So we stick to a clear priority for company-driven value change. There are only certain limited cases in which we would say a disruption of supply chain may affect public interest. This is clearly now public health. This is an area, a field where we say this is of public interest. And this being said, a systematic policy change, generally intensifying reshoring and relocation of production to the EU, needs to be avoided. So we don't want to have a nationalization of production or localization of production. We want, because we see that this would create inefficiency, this would create high costs, and that would send out a protectionist message to the world. And this is what we don't want, and because that would endanger our very successful economic model. And instead, we think we should focus on doing our homework and strengthen the resilience of our supply chains. And in this context, I would like to highlight 3 aspects. First of all, we need to ensure the competitiveness of European industry by setting the right policy framework and incentives. Inter alia, this holds true for the field of tax policy, energy prices, which are very important, infrastructure and regulatory policy. And secondly, we need to foster rules-based trade. This includes a strengthening of the WTO, you know, all the problems with the appellate bodies and all the other kind of problems. And by doing this, we can create legal certainty and reduce trade barriers for economic operators. And thirdly, we need to diversify the US trade relations. This applies to all levels of trade policy, be it the multilateral, plurilateral, or bilateral trade dimension. To make it short, no, I do not see a paradigm shift to answer your question, but we all should and need to ensure that it stays that way. Therefore, we should maintain our focus on open markets and rule and value-based trade. We should continue shaping globalization, in particular in the interest of a resilient EU economy. So looking forward to your discussion. Thank you very much for your invitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, State Secretary Nussbaum, for your clear position on supply chains, on the competitiveness and the rules-based trading system. Parliamentary State Secretary Bartlett, earlier on, we heard from ITC Executive Director Pamela Cook-Hamilton how international supply chains contribute to wealth creation and the inclusion of local business in developing countries into the global economy. Do you share this position, and how, from your point of view, can supply chains contribute to growth and prosperity in developing countries? Do you have to turn your microphone on? It's not working yet.
I think
yeah, here we are.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Mr. Wieck, ladies and gentlemen, I have a little bit of problem because my staff prepared only a German speech for me. I was told that there is a simultaneous translation, but there isn't it. So I try to translate this German speech in front of me. Actually, it's a little bit a challenge for me, but I try to do it. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me thank you very much, first of all, being part of this ICC forum, because my BMZ, my ministry, the ICC and the DHL work together since many years, and it's a good cooperation. So thank you very much for this. As we heard in the other speeches, the Corona pandemic showed us how close the world is together and how fragile the international supply chains are. The coronavirus is not only a health crisis, 176 million infections and 3.8 million dead people showed us that this is a really strong crisis, and this health crisis overcome and to economic crisis. The economic development and stability clashed and was hidden down worldwide. So we saw that supply chains broke down overnight, and a lot of sectors in our industry have problems to get their products from other countries. the poor countries are most clashed, are most hidden from this crisis. The poor countries are more stronger hidden than the rich countries, and the poor people in the countries of our cooperation, our partner countries, our development countries, they are hidden very strong. The United Nations say that 124 million people suffer of extreme poorness, and the ILO says that 250 million workers lost their work, and 232 million people suffer of hunger, and they have no more food, and the high prices for the food are a real problem in these countries. So we saw that the environment was destroyed, and the workers had bad conditions worldwide, and the violations of human rights were rising up. Many countries, the workers in the mining sector or in other countries, in the garment industry, they are suffering from bad conditions in following the corona pandemic. 73 million people work in dangerous conditions. They work on mines, they work on fields for nutrition, and worldwide 160 million children don't have the possibility to go to school. They have to work. That's wrong in our position, and that are conditions that we cannot allow. Worldwide, we have 25 million workers. They work under conditions that are unacceptable. So I think we have to do a lot to have fair conditions in our supply chains. And we think in the BMZ that our partner countries have a great potential for getting better conditions in the companies, in the supply chains, and to do more against poorness and hunger. I think it's our responsibility to build up fair supply chains, sustainable supply chains, as one possibility to do more for better development in our partner countries. First of all, the governments have to do their work, and the German government is doing a lot to get better conditions in our development countries. The second point is that the consumers have to do their part and have to buy fair and sustainable produced products. And third, the companies have to do their responsibility in their supply chains and have to look on human rights and social standards. So I think a lot of companies do that, but not all. That was the reason why my ministry, the BMZ, together with two other ministries, set up our supply chains due diligence law that we decided last week in the German Parliament. And with this law, our companies have to orient themselves at the United Nations guidelines for human rights. And up to 2023, our companies with more than 3,000 employees have to look for their due diligence and for sustainable supply chains. And up of 2024, all companies with more than 1,000 employees have to do that. This law concludes all sectors and is producing clarified jurisdiction and transparency in the supply chains. And I think this law is a good compromise between more human rights and the demands of the economy to have a law that is reliable and that is possible to set it in work. We hope that the EU will coming up next year. EU Commissar Reinders said that in autumn he will show us a new law in the European level. So we hope that with this law we get more resilience in our supply chains, and we will help our companies wherever we can do this. With our help desk for economy and human rights, we help a lot of companies to do their responsibilities. The help desk helped 2017 more than 900 companies in this way, and we work together with our partner countries. We enhanced our budget for economic cooperation from 85 million euros in 2014 to 400 million euros in this year, and in 40 Chamber of Commerces in our development partner countries, we have so-called business scouts, and they are helping our German companies to find the right partners in these countries. So we do a lot of things beside our initiatives in some sectors, like the textile initiative or the Forum Sustainable Cocoa, to do a lot of things for better and sustainable supply chains. I think we need a smart mix between the law of governments, between standards, and between multi-actors and partnerships of all partners. They are working together in this sectors. So thank you very much. I hope it was a little bit understandable, but it was a great challenge for me to do it without any preparation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bartley. You did that perfectly. I'm very grateful for your flexibility, and I'm very sorry if there was a misunderstanding about the language. I think you sent a very clear message to the panel and to the audience that the sustainability of supply chains is not an issue only of parts of the society, but of society as a whole. And only the society as a whole can manage the challenges which surround this issue. So once again, thank you very much for your contribution. John, international supply chains depend on open borders and on free market access. However, the guardian of the rules-based global trading system, the World Trade Organization, has been weakening for years. Hardly any substantial agreements were negotiated, and urgently needed reforms are stalled. What is global business doing to revive the rules-based global trading system? Very easy question.
Thanks very much, Oliver. And a big shout out to you and to Holger and to all our friends at ICC Germany. And as always, delighted to see the range of people who are interested in engaging in this discussion. And I must say, it's an honor to be on the stage with Minister Nussbaum and to the extremely linguistically agile Norbert Bartel. Well done, good outcome. And I must say, Frank, I just sent a note to my office. You know, Frank Apple said some really sensible things about sustainability and supply chains. We better get some of that data, because this battle, as you say, goes on, where there's an argument against e-commerce vis-a-vis sustainability, and our hypothesis is exactly the opposite. So practical examples are always useful. It's a very interesting question, the way you pose it. I suppose I want to come at it in a particular way. I think to understand the challenges and therefore the relevance of business requires us to actually, in a sense, understand what the problem is. And I see the problem with the WTO in three ways. First of all, it's actually the fragility of the institution itself. And I heard Minister Nussbaum talk about the need to strengthen. What that actually means is you're strengthening something because it's not at the strength you require. I would say there's a level of fragility there, and I want to talk about why that is and why that informs it. The other, the context in which we operate. And there's peculiar and I think quite intense complexity around the current context in which we operate. And obviously that's informed by the pandemic, but also, as was said before in your question to Minister Nussbaum,
there is an argument about the way in which the global balance is able to enable the sort of equilibrium that could actually allow an institution like the WTO to function effectively. By the way, it's not just that that's important, but the third element becomes very critical. And I think there's a crisis of leadership. I think anyone who runs an organization, I've run a big law firm, I sit on the board of lots of investment companies, we have lots of assets. Even in the pandemic, what we look at most is really around the leadership of the organizations, airports we own, tollways we own, etc. And it's amazing how leadership does make a difference. And leadership does and should and must make a difference at the WTO, and we might talk about that. But let's just look at the fragility of the institution. And from my perspective, and this is my perspective, you've got to look at the root of the WTO. The WTO came into existence in 1995, and I'm not going to give you a history lesson, but it's important to think about the context of 1995. In 1995, China was not in the WTO. China was running growth levels around mid-teens, 13 to 15% year on year. The rest of the world, particularly parts of the northern world, were not running anywhere near as high. In 1995, the internet was not in, which was just coming into the public domain. And even that wasn't enough, because the very e-commerce systems that Frank was talking about, the payment systems that attached to the internet to create e-commerce didn't actually come into existence until after the WTO commenced. Also, this historically, in 1995, the US was able to bring to an end the war in the former Yugoslavia with the Dayton Accords. Now, the reason I refer to those, and I'm not going to tell you which movie was the most popular in 1995, though, it was actually Toy Story #1, which has actually had 3 more versions in the same period, and yet we've never seen one update of the WTO rules. But there's a couple of things that it's really important to understand there. The US showed global leadership. It was prepared to actually use political capital to resolve global disputes. It was visible globally. That has actually been an aspect that's been missing. And you go to the balance of responsibilities in the global world. That has been a level of disequilibrium that's occurred, which actually has enabled some of the challenges, which actually support some of the fragility. The other issue, which was actually running around in 1995, was the fact that the internet was not in the public domain, and there was no real understanding of what digital commerce, e-commerce meant that the rules of the road, which actually went to the establishment of the WTO, did not deal with this important part of the economy. And we know the speed with which the e-commerce and the digital revolution has taken place. And interestingly, we'll come back to it, as we know, the rulebook of the WTO has not been updated to incorporate that. So we're actually operating with a system, one, without the kind of balanced arrangements we had in terms of geopolitical power, and not when it came into existence. Secondly, with a rulebook which is actually absent for an important element, and what is seen as the defining element, putting aside geopolitical issues of the economy of the 21st century, which is the digital economy. And third, and most importantly, we wanted, and it's not me, I'm an Australian, of course Australia wanted China in, because of, those days we did. I think there's a very different attitude towards China right now in Australia. But everyone wanted China in the WTO because of the growth rates. They thought if we get China into the WTO and we can normalize its behaviors in that context, that'll be great. But there was a couple of assumptions that underpin that, and there were 2 heroic assumptions. One, that systemically important economies like China, like India, like Brazil, would continue to reform internally to ensure that their actual economic settings were aligned to the market-based economic settings of the WTO. That has not happened. If it has happened, it's only happened partially. And there's a consequence to that, because the actual settings for the WTO were based upon a functioning market economy and the requirement for members to actually align with that. And that has not happened. And that has given rise to tension. I'll come back to the consequences of that in a second. The other historic and heroic, there was a different kind of mood globally in 1995. I talked about the Dayton Accord, etc. There was a sense of optimism about globalization, which, and I'm with Frank, and I'm with Ulrich, and I'm with Norbert, and I'm with Holger here. We should maintain that optimism. There's a lot of false news around globalism, but it's fair to say that one of the historic assumptions, or brave assumptions, was that global trade would lift all boats. Global trade, on average, has improved the global condition, has improved the net position of global citizens on average, on aggregate. But it's also fair, when you parse the numbers, to find areas where there has been a lack of access to the benefits of trade. And these are not just in developing countries, these are in developed countries. These are in the Midwest in the US, parts of large cities, etc. Because what did not happen to actually underpin and support that glowing ambition and that heroic assumption, the necessary investment in skills transfer, the actual necessary investment in public policy to enable education, all these sorts of things to actually would have mitigated it. And the other thing was the failure to understand that it wasn't necessarily trade that was going to cause the restructure. It was going to be technological innovation. I don't blame anyone for that, but there are consequences to that. So we have a system which is designed for a functioning market, on functioning market economic principles. We have systemically important economies which were entered into the system with the assumption that they would reform themselves to bring themselves into alignment, and that hasn't happened. And so you then get a tension. And so you've not been able to have an upgrade of the rule book over the last, since 1995, to actually reflect the contemporary economy in which we operate. And then what you're also seeing is because we can't get, because of the rules of the WTO, a lot of these decisions we need, because of this tension point, it kind of rubs up against itself. A lot of it gets pushed into the dispute resolution area. And so what's happened is that the dispute resolution area, the pellet process, has actually started fiddling in almost judge-made policy. And that, of course, has caused huge offense to the US, huge offense, by the way, to other developed economies as well, because that wasn't the purpose of the appellate process. Now, I'm just putting all those out there because it's important for us to understand why this institution is fragile right now, and it might actually help inform what needs to be done in order to reform or strengthen the institution. The second area I want to touch on is the complexity, the intense complexity of the current environment in which the WTO is operating. There is no doubt that the pandemic reveals a lot of challenges. I mean, the ICC is, I suppose, when I took over, we were in a particular course of action. The pandemic happens. I rearranged or repivoted the whole of the organization to fight the pandemic and to ensure, to work to try to bring them into the pandemic as quickly as possible. Why is that? Because we're about growing the economy, revitalizing trade and advancing sustainability. You can't grow the economy if you've got a pandemic raging, if you don't have everyone with access to vaccines. We see that as the best way of bringing it to an end. So we've been focused on that as well. But what we have seen, and it actually partly goes to some of the challenges we saw with the creation of the WTO, has been, in the midst of all this, the rise of nativist pressures, particularly around protectionist measures. And it's actually extraordinary to look, and I did a piece to air, and I've actually been involved with the G20 finance ministers, G7, etc., all the way through. There's actually been an increase in export barriers, and many of those come from G7 members. We've also seen not even talking about vaccine nationalism, which we can talk at length about. We've also seen a maintenance and increase of export barriers and prohibitions on the movement of therapeutics. The UK, which chaired the G7, has something like 100 in place at the same time as they're calling for export alignment all across the world. So there's a real challenge out there. And why is that? Because even though it's economically been shown to people that you actually want to grow the economy, and then the failure to actually bring about an equal distribution of the vaccines, we've shown this in our studies being quoted by the IMF, etc., could lead to a $9.2 trillion hit to the global economy, 4.5 trillion of which will hit developed economies. The politicians are still not prepared to run the economic argument for why vaccine distribution should go on, and they're actually still prepared to allow and enable and actually increase protectionist measures in the midst of it. So what's going on there? So what we're seeing in this context is really not that protectionism suddenly comes alive, it's there. It's actually, it's better revealed. So you've got a fragile system, you've got increased protectionism, and the third one I'll talk about is a crisis of leadership. Where was the WTO in the COVID crisis? The WTO went to sleep during the COVID crisis. I had to bang on the door of the former Director General to get them to re-engage on issues like trade finance, which we see as potentially falling off a cliff. It took a lot of effort to get them to even reconvene on that. So that's why we have welcomed what we think is the opportunity for new leadership. And leadership does matter of institutions. There is no doubt about it. What you need, if you want to reform this organization, strengthen this organization, make it relevant, you need a leader with a bold ambition. But you need a leader with expertise, and you also need a leader who's prepared to take risks, I think, at this point in time. And genuinely, I think we've got that with Dr. Ngozi. I spent time with her last week. I'll be speaking with her again next week. She's, by the way, extremely open to engaging with business. She needs to balance that, as she must, with engagement with civil society. because the WTO does not just stand for business, though we are the end users of it. But what she's prepared to do is actually breathe some life into the organization and actually show that the organization is capable of it. She's made it relevant in the COVID-19 period. She's prepared to take a huge risk of what we saw as a fundamental, which is showing signs of life in the WTO, and that's about getting movement on this fishery subsidies agreement, which might sound like almost an arcane thing to talk about as such a sophisticated business discussion. But you know, the fishery subsidy agreement is the only agreement at the WTO that deals with the environment at the moment, and actually is the only agreement that might actually is very close to an end. And it's been in discussion for 20 years, and leaders at the G20 level and at G7 level have told the WTO and their ambassadors and members to close that off for the last 3 years, and yet they still haven't done so. She's convening the whole ministerial group, 150 nations, what the number is, to actually try and crunch that through. That's a huge gamble. But what I like about it is she's prepared to take that step. First of all, to make the WTO relevant in the process of COVID. The second is actually to take some steps to actually breathe sign of life in it. And the third is to actively engage with business. So we will be working with the WTO, and this is where business will be very, I think, must be engaged. We will be surveying the global world, as we've done on other things during the crisis itself, about the needs of business in terms of the WTO. That is extremely useful. As you know, in any advocacy, data is really important, and particularly data from businesses and particularly data from SMEs. We know that politicians, we know at a global level, they're very sensitive to the concerns of the SMEs, particularly given the fragility because of the crisis. And actually bringing all that together can create a powerful movement, because we actually have to shift with some of the naysayers of the WTO, who are actually then trying to trade off all the time to stop things moving because they don't get X, Y, and Z. Because we need movement to enable a globally effective public good, which is a digitally curated commons, which can be best curated through the WTO. We need that because what we actually want is to have the capacity for e-commerce, digital, to become effective as a tool and platform for business in the 21st century, and having a sound basis for that is actually critical from our point of view. So that's the way I see it, and that's where I think business fits in. And I do think understanding the problem is one of the first steps you need to do. And I think hopefully I've explained to you where I see the problem, how I define it, and what I think we need to do about it. Thanks, Oliver.
Thank you very much, John, for this very clear position on the future of WTO and the role global business can play in this context. Mr. Appel, we have heard a lot about the integration of developing countries into the International Division of Labor, and I can imagine that this is certainly also in the interests of a company like Deutsche Post DHL. How is your company contributing to the integration of local business in developing countries into the global economy?
Yeah, I think, Oliver, first, let me say, you know, it's interesting anyway, if you think what is happening at the moment. It's a little bit looking back 500 years, you know, then in Germany, printing was invented. At the same time, actually, the heritage of our company is 531 years this year. We were founded in 1490. And the combination of printing and postal services at that time enabled what we, you know, remember as the starting point in Europe, you know, as really this strong power building of Europe as a fortress for economic growth somehow. Because what was possible was exchange of information for everybody. What we see now with the internet and the global logistics change is, if you sit in any country of the world and you are a bright person, you first will get education through the internet. What you need is internet access, for sure. Unfortunately, you know, that is because we have globalization, is more affordable than ever before. So you get education, and then you need connectivity to the world. And this is what we learn, and this is what we are doing. We are working with, you know, the BMZ together and others together to really educate local entrepreneurs. What do you need to know to get connected to the world? If you have a bright idea, your product should be sold not only in your country, it should be sold around the world, and that is your future. And that is democratization of access somehow. And that is great to see. And we are sponsoring that very much because, of course, trade is still complex. These guys need to know how they can ship around the world, you know, how return solutions are working, how customs processes are working. We have the knowledge, and we call it Go Trade. You know, we want to help, you know, young entrepreneurs and smaller companies to get connected, because that's a sign of participation, inclusion. And this is just one. We do a lot of stuff, but this I'm very proud of, because inclusion is a key word. And like the printing from Mr. Gutenberg in Germany and our postal services enable to really exchange information in broader terms. The internet combined with logistics services allow entrepreneurs. And I talk to entrepreneurs. That was actually a Canadian example, but this Canadian entrepreneur said, I came from Ukraine to Canada. I had nothing, but I had the idea, and I'm not talking about the product, but I had an idea about a product, but I wanted to sell it around the world, and I went to you, so how should I do that? And he shipped it finally to you 150, and this business is booming. So it's in e-commerce, a very small niche product. So a Ukrainian who moved to Canada started a business. Why we should not do with the people in Africa, in Latin America, and India? And I think that's a job of businesses to put ourselves in their shoes and to help them to overcome the problem that global trade has still, customs processes have, to understand that. And this is a key initiative of ours. We don't have any instant return of that. We hope that these businesses will prosper, and then of course they need help on the logistics side. And don't forget that they get some education from us, but of course there is no linkage to that they are buying services from us. We believe we have to enable people, if they get access to the internet, which of course is more done by telecoms in the countries. If they have that, they can get education, and then they can start their business somehow. And that is helping. I think these people, these entrepreneurs, they will create jobs in their local countries. And I think that's a great example how really global trade really can help to develop countries, because these people will learn new tricks, and they will be good advocates as well of a liberal democratic society, because of course, we as a company who are working, we're talking about that at the same time. So that's our job. I can not influence what WTO does. We can raise our voice, but at the end of the day, that's a part of the politicians. I think we should do what is in our hands, and our hands is to help people in countries to understand better how global trade works, and that is what we see as an objective and clear goal for our company.
Thank you very much, Frank Appel, for this insight into the very impressive activities of Deutsche Post in developing countries. We are also heavily engaged in many ICC activities in this context. And again, thank you very much for that. Very much appreciated. With only 20 minutes to go, I will try to manage a brief second round of questions on how the distinguished panelists envision the future of international supply chains. And I will start with Secretary Nussbaum again. Digitalization of foreign trade, AI-driven delivery processes, and the creation of interactive logistic platforms are some of the current trends in international supply chains. Is the Standort Deutschland ready for the future?
Yeah, I think we are ready for the future. And if you ask me to do an advertising blog,
very briefly, 3 minutes.
Oliver, I need more than 5 minutes. I would do it longer, because I think we have really a good position, as we really know that we have seen in these global uncertainties that resilient supply chains are more important than ever, and digitalization and automation of processes is a key to create transparency and optimizing workflows. And I must not tell it to you, Mr. Appel will know much better than me. You have these kind of digital technologies to identify disruptions of the supply chains. And if you do that correctly, you can even anticipate your problems, you can manage your problems, you can react properly and adequately, and you can increase the resilience and the efficiency of these kind of value chains. And therefore, these kind of technologies, whether it's data analytics or whether it's blockchain or whether it's artificial intelligence, they give a major contribution to enhancing process efficiency and effectiveness. And on the other side, also the digital business to business, the B2B, marketplaces, they do help to strengthen and also to optimize supply chain. And if you analyze our economy, you are going to see that this economy is highly specialized. We have a big industrial expertise, and if you combine the digital issues with our expertise in the industrial sector, this makes it unique. But it all depends, and that is also the challenge which we do see, that we have, let's say, access to data. That was Mr. Van Appel said, and that we have also a willingness and an openness of businesses to share these data in a trusted way, to give them comfort and to share and to see, to make them convinced that sharing data, using data, give them a better position in the market, and they are in a win-win situation to do so. And that's why we really need an open digital ecosystem to enable European companies and also the business to let's say, to develop their business models and to be effective and competitive. And therefore, in our ministry, we developed from the very beginning, that was an important project to my minister, Mr. Altmaier, for a joint European project, which we call Gaia X. So that is a platform which gives open access and which helps companies to share their data on a, let's say, on a clear and defined basis. And that's what we can do as governments. We are not the better entrepreneurs, but what we have to do is to provide a suitable and to provide also a stable environment that allows the companies to plan ahead and that gives them a clear framework. And that's what we try to do, and that's what Minister Altmaier also formulated in his so-called strategy, industrial strategy, where he said we need an active industrial policy where we provide this environment and give our companies and our business a framework to plan and to grow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nussbaum. And if you agree, I would very much like to come back to you and to the ministry when we start our workshop on the future of international supply chains. It would be interesting to hear from you and your colleagues about the various initiatives of the ministries. Frank Appel, from the point of Deutsche Post DHL, which are the three biggest challenges your group faces in the design of smart supply chains?
Yeah, I think, many things, of course, is in our own hands to control that. So, of course, digitalization is is a challenge mentally more for the people that, they are afraid of that they might lose their job. And that, of course, that's always a big challenge. In our own company, we said from the beginning, or 2 years ago already, maybe 1/3 of the jobs will be gone by 2030. But we will create probably more jobs because we were 50% larger. So what we need is that people are adaptive to the change and willing to change, because they will get different jobs, probably better jobs in our company than they had before, because the digitalization will replace that. I think that's more an internal challenge. Technology-wise, I think there's plenty of opportunity. What really worries me on the whole design of supply chain the most is the inconsistency of policy making at the moment. We have conflicts between the superpowers, and Europe is in the middle of that somehow. And we have conflicting regulations increasingly, and that is a tremendous threat to global economy overall. The legislation of the US is not consistent with Europe and China, Russia, even to let Russia aside. So we have to find a way. Sometimes I compare that with the great success the world had to get a START agreement on nuclear weapons. We agreed somehow, even controlling vice versa what the countries are doing, and I think that's a great achievement of humanity, and that kept nuclear powers where they should be, not in the arsenal and not used. I think we have to think about the next 10 years, 15 years, how we get along, accepting that we have different, different systems, political systems in countries, but still can work together and are not having conflicting laws around the world, because that will destroy supply chains at the end of the day, and that would create consequentially significant problems for any economy on the world. And I think that is a part where, you know, it's good now to see that the G7, I think, gets more aligned again, which is the first step, because if the G7 is aligned, then at least they speak with one language or one voice. But I think we have to find ways how to work together on a global scale. Otherwise, it will become very complex to operate even global supply chains. You know, not only for us, you know, we are the executor for others, but for companies who are producing around the world products. And I think this is the biggest challenge, and definitely for the next decade. And we have to find smart answers to the challenge. Otherwise, we will put all ourselves in a much more difficult spend, because China needs the world, Europe needs the world, the US needs the world. And if we are not working together and say we are better off when we have, you know, North America alone, Europe alone, and China alone, I think we all will pay a high price for it. So that's the biggest challenge. If I look 10 years ahead, how can we really still provide sustainable, reliable supply chains with very different and conflicting regulations we have, you know, increasingly in place around the world?
Thank you very much, Frank Appel. Mr. Bartle, do you agree? And from your point of view, how should a sustainable and smart supply chain of the future look like?
Thank you very much. So I think not only in the future, just now we have a lot of companies which have real sustainable supply chains. They are very engaged in fair wages, in good conditions for their workers, and in no labor for children. And I think that they are a part of this condition. They respect the human rights, not as an add-on, but as a part of their own responsibility to get better standards for all sectors in our supply chains. And I think the digitalization is a big possibility to get more transparency. As my colleague Nussbauer mentioned, we have more possibilities to track our supply chains, and therefore digitalization is a good part to get better supply chains in the future. I think with these possibilities, we can manage our risk easier, and we can open new possibilities for working together. I am very proud that my BMZ is working together with DHL, with Frank Appel, in this project named the Digitizing Global Trade. This project is supporting some countries in digitalization for our trading corporations. So I think digital solutions should not only stand for themselves, they should add a value, adding to this what we have, maybe in economic, in social, and ecologic circumstances. So I hope that sustainable supply chains will be one part to get better solutions and to be prepared for new pandemics in the future, that the new pandemics that we will have will not have so serious consequences as now as the pandemic of COVID-19. And I hope that the digitalization will help us to enhance the resilience of humans and environment, and to be a part of a better globalization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
One sentence at last. We don't work for free trade, we work for fair trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, State Secretary. Well taken. Speaking of digitalization, John, how is the ICC contributing to the digitalization of global trade in general, and in particular to the digitalization of supply chains? In 3 minutes, please.
Thanks, Rachel. Just quickly going back to Frank's point, just to remind everyone, one of the most amazing features of the ICC is that, you know, we're for purpose, we're an institution, we're not for profit. We crowd in 45 million plus in more than 120, 130 countries. We're actually the largest functioning international group in the world. We actually have China working in the same room as Taiwan. We have ICC USA in the same room as ICC Tehran. We have ICC Israel in the same room as ICC Syria. I say that because we want to see what we can do with this commons that we actually have. It's a business commons. We have our own courts, We have the power and ability to create standards where governments can't, and we actually have institutional clout. So there's something to that in terms of the functionality, given the horizon for the next 10 years is not glowy or not particularly positive about global business, global governmental cooperation. These use of these tools can be very useful. Can I just pick up on three things and actually building a little bit? First, on terms of digitization, a classic for us is we're working very closely with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement Secretary General in Accra at the moment. Because one of the issues around digitization is it's good to talk about it, but we also want to ensure that when you use digital documents, they're legally enforceable. That's actually an impediment unless they are. So we've been working very hard, and we're very proud of the work we did with the most recent G7 communique and the support for access to and use of the model laws to actually allow recognition of electronic transmissions to actually give them legal status. We are working with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement because without legally enforceable arrangements, a lot of the promise of that agreement, opening up a $3 trillion economy, which will enable SMEs, will just not happen. So we're working on that. And the other thing we're doing is we're helping build an economic case for them to take to ministers. Because there's one thing to talk about the positives of digitization. The other is to get policy settings in place, because there is still inertia, and not just in the developing world, about the translation of the opportunities of digitization into legally consistent, comprehensible global frameworks. We think that's fundamental to actually get this opportunity of digitization really available to SMEs and micro SMEs in the real economy. The second thing is we actually do stuff. I mean, we've created centers of entrepreneurship, which are designed to actually allow SMEs, particularly in emerging and troubled economies, to actually, and entrepreneurs to build their futures. We're actually basically trying to get more and more people invested in this, functioning market economy. And we think part of that is giving them access to digital tools, supporting them. We're in Istanbul, we're in Beirut, we're about to open 4 simultaneously in Africa, another 5 in Latin America, in Asia, and then we're coming back to Central Europe, and then we've just been asked to open one in Southern Europe as well. My aim is to have something like 20 operating over the next 2 years, and then we're going to see if we can actually take that footprint more broadly. And that will be about ensuring not only when we talk about digitization, we give people the tools, but also the ability. And we'd really welcome the support of DHL on that, just bear in mind, and also the German Development Agency. We work with you on some things, but if you're serious about building functioning market economies, we'll be doing this in the Northern Triangle, by the way, with the Americans. You actually need to get people invested in it. And the final thing, just in terms of campaigns, we are running a campaign to digitize 5 million SMEs in Africa. We're actually making a lot of headway on that, but you actually need, again, not just to talk about access to digitization, you need to give people access to digitization. And the cost may be low, but the cost is still not low enough for many, and we actually need, and we're working on ways of doing that as well. And then to take that digitization and help them build business models so that they can function with the digitization they have, not just to be connected, but to build lives for themselves and their families. That's what we're doing. It's ambitious, but it's a fun time at ICC.
Very ambitious. Thank you very much, John. The last question goes to Holger Bingmann, Chairman of ICC Germany. Today we heard a lot about supply chain resilience, about the potential of digitalized trade and supply chains, the integration of economies of the South into the world economy, on company due diligence and much more. In your view, how should a sustainable digital and smart supply chain of the future look like?
Thank you very much for that last question. I think we heard a lot about digitalization, and I think we all agree from an entrepreneur standpoint that it will save money, it will make supply chains secure, more secure than in the past. So that is the right way to follow. But let me point out from an entrepreneurial point of view, I think the important thing is a little bit of rethinking your supply chains. Did it correct in the last year to get in such a dependency from Chinese suppliers? Staatssekretär Nussbaum mentioned about raw materials. Also, didn't we maybe look in a wrong direction, bringing us in a very strong dependency? So, absolutely, my plea is stay in touch, to make use of opportunities like this, talk to each other. Think, or maybe a little bit of your traditional friends. Maybe we should do a little bit more business with our neighbors, or that we have some traditional mutual understandings too. So I think a little bit of rethinking these sustainability in supply chains with traditional relations might be definitely of interest. So my plea is happy to see all these pictures from the weekend. We are lucky that the customs war, which started between China, Europe, and the US, looks like coming to at least to a 5 years stop. This is something very positive for the European or the German industry. So thank you very much for this. And it's the result of being able talking to each other. And that's why I mentioned it twice. I like the pictures that we saw through the weekend. And that's why I like these dialogues and the workshop we did today and the ones will follow. Absolutely looking forward for great participation in these workshops of policymakers like we had, of entrepreneurs, practitioners, and stakeholders from all around the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Holger Bingmann. Dear speakers of this year's Forum on International Supply Chains, dear participants from Germany and from many other countries around the world, thank you very much for joining and sharing your views. It was great to have you with us, and we appreciate the time you spent with us. The forum will be, as mentioned several times, be followed by a series of workshops starting on June 30th on supply chain finance, followed by another workshop on the important issue of digitalization of supply chains on July 21st. More workshops will be organized through October 26th, when this year's forum will conclude with a panel discussion about the latest trends in tomorrow's supply chains. I very much hope that, if the pandemic allows, most of you will be able to join the final event of our forum in person. More details can be found on our website, iccgermany.de. Thank you very much again for joining, and stay tuned. Goodbye.